to Blackbird Writers Presents. I am Tracy S. Phillips, and today I'm here talking with Kenneth Humphrey. Kenneth B. Humphrey is the author of 9 books, a middle grade trilogy called The Hunts of Rami Ryland, a murder thriller trilogy called The Killing Arc, and a pair of teen zombie apocalypse books. He frequently appears in the Writers' Room podcast for the Wisconsin Writers Association as an interviewer. And today we're here to chat about his latest novel, The Breakfast Jury, which is a murder mystery based on a real-life Kenosha, Wisconsin trial for which he was on the jury, and he was jury foreman. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
This is so great to talk to you today. Thanks so much
You
for
too.
coming on. So you have 9 books under your belt. You have been a working author for quite some time. What got you started in this industry?
Most people's origin story is pretty similar, right? I read a lot when I was a child, and I always wanted to write. And mine actually wasn't that different. I did read a lot, and I did think about writing, but I never thought I would really write growing up. I would say, "Oh, I want to be an author," but I never really put any effort towards it. And then one day, when one of my children was in 4th grade, we were at a parent-teacher conference, and the teacher had said at the time, "Oh, he's a good reader, but there's not a lot of stuff out there for 10-year-old boys." And I remember thinking, really? I didn't know that. I guess I wasn't aware. She's like, "No, they're just most of the material out there is more geared towards girl readers. And so it's hard to keep the boys engaged." And so I started thinking about that. By the time we left the parent-teacher conference, I had the outline of a book in my head. And so I feverishly spent the next 8 months writing that book, and then went back to his class at the end of the school year and just kind of gave a little speech on the book, gave them all an autographed copy, and tried to gear it towards, 10-year-old boys, a reader. And that's what became The Hunts of Rami Ryland. The first book was The World Serpent, and that's what I went back and gave them to. Or gave them. And so, yeah, my origin story is kind of really was just sparked. Like there's a moment in time where I can point back and say, "Oh yes, this is what I'm going to write."
Really cool. Um, and so today we're talking about The Breakfast Jury, which is based on a really remarkable true story. And I'm dying to know, like, your inspiration for this book.
So for the book itself, right? We were in trial for a month, right? So you're locked in a room with 15 other people that are just complete strangers to you. So you end up chatting like any other group. You end up chatting, and it came around that I was an author, and someone was like, "Oh, well, you should write a book about this." Right? And we were already probably 2 weeks into it, and I thought, well, I'm not really a nonfiction writer. And also, courtroom tell-alls, they've just been done to death, right? Every time you have a big, high-profile trial, which this was for the Kenosha area, it was pretty high profile, you get people that pop up out of the woodwork and write about their experience. And it did not really trigger me. But then they're like, "Well, you should make it then a fiction book." And that's what I started thinking about. It's like, oh, how could I turn our experience into what I know and what I write most frequently, which is the murder mystery or the murder thriller genre. And so just like with that parent teacher conference, I just sort of muddled things in my head for a while. I mean, my wife tells me I tend to do that, as I muddle things in my head. And on the last couple of days before we were done, I told them, I said, 1 year from now, guys, we're going to get back together for a reunion. I'm gonna have a book for all of you, and it's gonna star us in it, right? And so that's kind of what got me to that stage, was them wanting a book, me thinking, oh, there might actually be a story here set as a fictionalized version of what we had went through.
That's awesome. And before we get into like the trial details and all of that, you already had a trilogy out, The Killing Man, The Killing Face, and Arch Enemy, right? Were 3 books that you'd
Correct.
written before.
Correct.
And so the character from that series comes back in this book, right?
Correct. The main character's name is Aramis Archibald White. He was the main character in books 2 and 3. of the Killing Arc trilogy. I brought him back for this fourth one, but this fourth one isn't really connected to those three other than the fact that it's him. But everything else is kind of disconnected.
Oh, okay. Then tell us about the trial.
All right. So for anybody listening who's not familiar with this trial, a man murdered his wife using antifreeze back in 1998. He poisoned her with antifreeze, put it in some type of juice like orange juice or wine or something similar. And it came at the heels of a years-long campaign by him just to, I guess, harass, intimidate. Like he would send, pornographic type pictures. He would leave them around the house and then say he found those and that was for her because she hadn't had an affair like 10 years prior for which she was, remorseful. But apparently he never got over that. And so he would sit and just harass her by saying, I found these pictures. This must be your ex-lover sending these to us. And at some point towards the end, he began having an affair of his own and then ended up poisoning, his wife at that time. Ostensibly the theory is so that he's free of her and can go move on with his life and his mistress. So that was kind of the background of the trial. He was convicted in 2008 for life, in Wisconsin. And then it turned out later on, in whatever the late 2000, early 2020 time frame, that the Wisconsin Supreme Court vacated the verdict because the prosecution had used a piece of evidence that it turns out they should not have been able to use. And that piece of evidence was what was called a letter from the grave. So this wife, who had been enduring this campaign of harassment and worried about what's going on, actually wrote a letter that said, if I die, look at my husband. I think he's trying to do me harm. So she wrote this letter, put it in a sealed envelope, and gave it to one of her neighbors. So she literally foretold her own death. And when they used that as part of the first trial's evidence, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, no, you can't use that, vacate the verdict. So we had to go do it all over again. And that's where I came in 2023. Myself and my fellow jurors ran that race again, right? The same as the previous jury back in 2008. At that time, it was the longest trial in state history. It lasted 7 weeks. Ours lasted about 4 weeks, so it was still very long. I don't know if 7 weeks is still the record in Wisconsin. I never looked that up, but I'll tell you what, even 4 weeks, locked in a room Monday through Friday with the same 15 people and listening to all the evidence on something like this, yikes. I would not wish that on anybody. But it does give you a ton of meat for the bone, right? I mean, this guy was a character, right? As we all were sitting there, listening to the evidence, listening to what the prosecution was bringing forth, showing us emails that he had sent, letters he had written, right? All this stuff. It's like, oh my word, right? This guy is something else, right? There are probably labels I could attach to it. I'm not sure any really fit, right? But there are plenty of labels to, attach to that type of behavior. And so just from a murder mystery standpoint, there was a lot of meat on the bone to work with. Beyond just telling it as what had happened, I'm like, oh, I can use this as the backdrop for a novel. And so that is what I ended up doing.
That's so cool. And and even as an author, you would be sitting there like just detailing like all of the interaction between the lawyers and the judge and all of the everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So so you must have changed some of the details for the book.
I did. So what I essentially did for the book is I blended stuff that happened in both trials. And I shouldn't even say that. I really used our trial, but sent it back to 1999 as if that was a 7-week long trial at that time. But I brought a lot of the actual, quotes, evidence that we saw, things that were said, things that my fellow jurors said when we were back in our rooms. A lot of those said, I just brought those directly into this story. and said, okay, here's the evidence, here's what we heard, here's what we said, here's what we did, as if we were existing back in 1999. So that's kind of how I blended the two things together. And simply because A, that was right after the actual murder happened, but B, using, Archibald White, well, he was living back in 1999. That was coming right off the heels of his time in the killing arc. So I'm like, oh, that the timeline flows perfectly, right? He's in the aftermath of what happened during that trilogy, and it's only been, a year later. So the timeline all fits. Everything kind of fit together nicely that way. Very fortuitous.
Yeah, that's great. Was it difficult to determine which truths stayed and which ones got left out?
Yeah, it was. And simply because there was so much there that I could have used, you know, in terms of evidence, whether it's forensic evidence or technological evidence, all this. There's so much to use that it was more difficult to kind of say, okay, what do I leave in?
Yeah.
Just to make it read, because I didn't want to bog it down with the monotonous details, because a trial like this sounds interesting, which it is in description, but 4 weeks of sitting there and listening to doctors and pathologists and all this stuff, it's mind numbing, right? It's
Yeah.
just, I mean, it's so hard to stay focused on that. So that I didn't want to bring back into the story, right? I didn't want to overload the reader with all this mundane detail that, while it mattered towards the end in the verdict, doesn't really matter in the sense of a novel, right? You want to
Right.
get to the meat of the stuff, but there's only so many times you need to show a forensic pathologist speaking on the
Right.
stand and
Right.
reiterating their testimony, right? You do one or two of those, and then you bring in different types of witnesses. So it's more
Right.
about, what do I leave out and what's worth
Yeah,
bringing in.
that makes sense. One of my favorite things about the breakfast jury was the way that you bounced between the trial scenes and the investigation, which in the book, the investigation that Archibald is going through, I hope I got his name right. Archibald, right? Yeah.
Yes.
um, that he's investigating something that happens 1 year later. But it really gives the reader the trial, the flavor of the trial, but also that tension of a current investigation, a current murder investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let's set up this story for our viewers.
Okay. And before I even set that up, that was also kind of forced by necessity, right? Because the murder happened in 1998, right? All his events in the killing arc were occurring in the early part of 1999. So I kind of, obviously he can't be in two places at once, and he can't be suffering from the aftermath of his actions in the killing arc. So I had to actually separate that by a year. So I had never written a book where there's dual timelines. Um, so it was kind of forced. But yeah, the way this works out is, you're following one thread of the plot, which is the experience of the jurors, everything they went through from the day one getting selected all the way through to, when they made their verdict, delivered their verdict. And intercut with this, then you have what we'll call modern day, the Archibald's timeline, modern day, when he's looking back at what went on during this trial and investigating, what happened afterwards, which was at their 1 year reunion, the jury, they got together, just like our jury did. They got together to celebrate the reunion, but that some of them ended up being poisoned. And so he's brought in by the husband of one of the jurors to say, no, they didn't drink too much. She was poisoned. And as he looks into it, he discovers, wow, the jurors were poisoned with antifreeze. It looks like they're poisoned with antifreeze, but what's going on? The guilty party is in jail. He's in prison. So it couldn't be him. Who's out to get revenge on this jury? Is it somebody doing it on behalf of the accused? Is it some other reason? So his biggest puzzle is, why would somebody want to poison this jury exactly 1 year later? And that was the challenge before him.
Right. Right. It was so good. So I saw this book description that said the breakfast jury is a blend of John Grisham and the Breakfast Club, which is like
Hmm.
such a great combo, right? And the cast of supporting characters, the jury, they are a super fun bunch. I liked how you wrote those chapters from like an omniscient point of view. So we got to see all of their emotional arcs like throughout. Um, so tell us about some of those primary players in the jury.
Okay, so first off, one of the things that I kind of noticed early on, I mean, I'll preface this by saying when I was young in my high school years, I think I probably watched The Breakfast Club every day during one summer after high school. I mean, I love that movie. And one of the things that I noticed, probably a week into this trial is I'm like, wow, it's just we're kind of interacting like the Breakfast Club, right? There were a couple people who played the John Bender character, the couple people who were the princess, a couple people who were the jock, just kind of in their personalities or the way they acted. And I just I'm like, that's interesting. And that stuck with me. And so then when I decided to do this book, I'm like, all right, I have to blend kind of the way the characters come together, right? We're all strangers. We all have different personalities. In the end, in real life, we all stayed together. We all stayed close, right? We've gotten together several times since then. But in the book, I wanted to kind of segment people out and say, okay, this is kind of the John Bender type character, like the antagonist, right? Somebody who's a little controversial or wants to stir the pot. Then you have somebody who just wants to follow the rules and make sure everything is done correctly. And there are a couple of people in the jury who were, you know, outsized in their personality more than others. And and while I tried to give everybody, fair coverage, you know, it just tended to lean towards a couple of people who just in the room were just more vocal or would say things or funnier or, just they stood out. And, without revealing a spoiler, I did have to contact one of the jurors and say, I'm sorry, I'm going to do you dirty in this book, but I'm just giving you a heads up. I needed somebody to play that role, and I think you're the one who can take it. And she was fine with it. But it was one of these, how do you, kind of describe these people, kind of get into their head a little bit without, I mean, I only knew them for a month, right? So there's no history with us that preceded the day one of
Right.
the trial. So I had to get in their head a little bit, but I'm only using what I learned of them, right, in that 4 week time period, right? So as an author, you gotta be kind of creepy if you're trying to project what somebody's saying just based on what you know of them, especially if you don't know them well. And that was another reason I use that omniscient POV. It does keep you from getting too deep into somebody's
Yeah.
head. You kind of give kind of superficial thoughts of what they're thinking, feeling, or saying. Um,
Right.
and that's easier to stay kind of at that surface level where my knowledge of them was at.
Right.
And again, it also served a purpose in terms of advancing the plot because I could bounce over to another character and say, okay, they're going to say this, which is going to move us forward in the plot on the next chapter or whatever, right? Because they
Right.
actually said that in real life, or it is something that's I think they would say based on their personality. So it
Right.
kind of ended up being almost a forced choice there as well.
Yeah. And just one of the things that was great about the Breakfast Club was that they represented like five stereotypes. Was it five or six stereotypes of people? And so you could identify with at least one of them, right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
I know which one I was. Which one were you?
So I always fashioned myself as a John Bender character,
Uh-huh.
even to the point where I think I spent one winter walking around with like a trench coat on and fingerless gloves, and I took a scarf and wrapped it around my head. I mean, I was such a weirdo as a kid, but that was the one I identified with the most, even though I probably lived more like the jock lifestyle, right, back
Yeah.
then.
Yeah. No, I was definitely the basket case.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was
Well, and it's funny,
not the popular girl.
right? And then, you know, kind of watching, observing all the fellow jurors. And it wasn't really, it didn't align that way, but it was, I won't say easy, but it did seem fairly easy to say, okay, this is this type of stereotype. We've got three people in the room who fit the John Bender, outcast stereotypes. We got three people who kind of sit there and don't say much. They play the Ali Sheedy role, right? Where they just kind of sit and they go along, and they don't say much, and you can tell they're thinking about something. So we kind of had those buckets, those rough buckets, even identified in our room.
Yeah. And in the opening of the book, Arch White, he is a disgraced detective, and he's asked to investigate the death of one of the jurors, like you said. But let's talk about Arch a little bit. What's his backstory? Must be given some in the other series, in the Killing Arc series.
Correct. So his backstory, starting book number 2, is he was essentially what you would call a minority hire in detective, the youngest detective in Chicago police history at that point in time. But he had to sue to get his badge, claiming essential discrimination. And so in the Killing Face book, he has just gotten his badge, right? It's his dream. He's now made detective at a very young age. And the first case he's handed is the murder of one of the people who helped represent him in his discrimination case. So not essentially the man who championed him and helped him earn his detective's tin. And so that was so he had this thing to prove. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just truly a minority hire. He didn't get it just because he won the lawsuit. He wanted to prove that he actually had the chops to be a very good detective. Well, across the course of the last 2 books in the Killing Arc series, The Killing Face and Arch Enemy, he essentially goes on to prove all that and completely sets his entire career on fire. Like at the end of it all, he's done. He's been stripped of his tin, his detective's tin. He's been labeled a persona non grata by the police department. He's been given a sanction that would actually prevent him from getting another police badge in the future. Like he couldn't just go up to Wisconsin, for instance, and get hired on to the police force there. So he has literally taken a stick of dynamite to his entire career, doing what he thought was right the entire time, which is to solve the murder and solve the conspiracy behind the murder. But in doing everything right, he ends up completely wrong. And so this story, The Breakfast Jury, picks up, essentially almost a year after he's torched his life, right? He's separated from his fiance. He's, living alone, just kind of wallowing in his own misery. And so when he gets a call from essentially a friend of a friend that says, "Can you help investigate they said my wife drank too much at a party, but that's not true. I think she was poisoned." He kind of sees that as his chance at redemption. Like, all right, fine. I don't have a badge, but I can be a private investigator and I can essentially solve this case. And that's, if he's got a character flaw that shows throughout the first 2 books of his, and then in this one, it's that he is so dogged and determined to do it that he will drive and drive and drive, even if he's sometimes driving down the wrong path. He thinks he's got it all figured out, and he's so determined that it may actually blind him to the fact that he doesn't have it figured out. And so that character flaw kind of comes through again. So you got a guy with a chip on his shoulder who wants to prove everybody wrong, and that chip is so big that he can't even see when he may be wrong.
Right.
And that kind of forms his whole story arc in this as well, especially towards the end. Kind of comes full circle for him.
It does. And I really hope, because he's a great character. So are there any books coming out in the future starring Archibald?
I don't have anything on the docket. But he is a character I like. And in the Killing Arc, there was another character who starred in the first book, Killing the Man. His name is Rick Killing. And he and Archibald crossed over in that second book. And they're kind of more like you think back to a Lethal Weapon combo, Danny Glover and Mel Gibson. They're kind of a pairing that way, where Rick Killing is just this bull in a china shop. And at that time, Arch was the one trying to be more restrained. I would love to try and bring them back together in more of kind of like a buddy mystery thriller, right? In other words, they get thrown back together, are forced to team up, and they have completely opposite personalities, and just let them go for another ride. I just haven't fleshed out how that would happen. But it is something, you know how you always have story ideas floating in the back of
Yeah,
your mind. This is
always.
one that is just looming large back there, right? It's a knot on the back of my skull, but I haven't figured out how to resolve it yet.
Yeah, it'll come to you. It'll come.
Oh, well. You just gotta let them percolate for a while, right?
Yeah, for sure. Um, and you have these other series too. Do you like writing middle grade fantasy, or there are more of those books coming out?
Um, I do like writing them because it's a different type of writing, right? This is where you really get to just kind of go hog wild fantastic for things because, the 10-year-old reader probably isn't quite as discerning on whether something is factual or even believable or how much of reality you have to set aside to accept it. So you can kind of go
Mhm.
hog wild and have these things happen that maybe an adult reader would say, oh, come on, that's not even realistic. So I did like it from that standpoint. I put together three of those books, and that third book did leave on a cliffhanger to set up a further set of books because I originally envisioned it as a 9-book story arc.
Wow.
I didn't have anything really plotted beyond like the fourth or fifth book, so I'd have to kind of think through that. But I do think that is, yes, that's one I'm going to pick up and put out book number 4, right? And just kind of keep chugging along on that. But just like everything else, I don't really have a set plot. I don't really have a set time frame yet for that.
Yeah. But I imagine your son is beyond the middle grade reading now.
Yeah, and the sad truth is, I don't know that he ever read it even, other than maybe the teacher forced him to read it. But my good Samaritan efforts to try and make a reader out of 10-year-old boys may have helped for others in the classroom. It didn't help with him. He's not a reader today.
Well, that's like I teach piano lessons, but I was never able to teach my kids. So,
Yeah. Yep. We give it our best shot, but in the
yeah,
end, they end up who they are.
that's exactly true. And so one of your side gigs obviously is interviewing authors for the WWA podcast.
Correct.
What's your favorite thing about that?
So the Midwest Writers Room podcast, yeah, we talk to authors, we talk to, people in the industry. We talk about how to develop your craft or what's your author's journey. I think probably my most favorite thing is exposure to all different authors that I probably would never come across in my real life, right? Like yourself, you were a guest on there. I probably would never have come across you otherwise if we hadn't had this podcast. And now I look at it, I'm like, God, I'm so glad we did. And
Maybe
so
at the
that's
conference.
probably yeah, and the conference. But I think it's just the broader exposure to other authors and then listening to some of the tales that these authors, weave. We live in this world where, we've got 700,000 new books every year popping out. We've got this avalanche of material that's out there, ranging everywhere from, this looks like a fifth grader wrote it, all the way to masterpieces that we may never even come across just because of the volume. And
Yeah,
so, it's one thing to go on to a site like an Amazon or a Barnes and Noble or walk your local bookstore and just skimming through books trying to find one to read. It's different when you actually are talking to an author
yeah.
and hearing how they came about the story, hearing what that story is about. It's like
The
there's
story
more of
behind the
an
story. Yeah.
right, there's more impact, there's more immediacy, there's more interest. My partner Luella, the co-host on this, we have both commented to each other that, our to be read pile has just gotten out of control since we started doing this podcast. Because I swear, every time we interview somebody, oh, I add another title onto that list.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we also do short episodes as that called chapter breaks, where it's specifically just about a book another author has put out. So they come on, tell us about your book, tell us, the story behind it, and then actually have them read like a 5-minute excerpt from it, right? Kind of using it as promo material for them. Well, goodness, the number of books that have come out of that I think, oh man, that sounds really good. I'm going to add that to the pile, which is now so long that I don't have enough years left in me to get through all the books that I've added on. But that is
So
absolutely the
true.
favorite part of it. It's just exposure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love talking with authors like you about their books. So you get the backstory, the story
Yeah.
behind the story. It just makes it all, I don't know, so much cooler, for
Right.
lack of a better
Yep.
word.
Yeah, because I'd like to read those books now and say, oh, I remember when they were talking about this part or this scene, or now I get, their origin spark for
Yeah,
this. Reading it, now I understand how it kind of manifested. So, it's
yeah,
kind of connecting those dots that are great.
yeah, exactly. Um, so just a really generic question. Are you a pantser or a plotter?
So I would, on my default state, I probably lean towards a pantser. So I'll generally, I have a story and I may do a quick write up, and it won't even be like chapter outlines. It may be a 2 or 3 page long syllabus, right? And then I may kind of cut out, okay, here's an important event in the middle, here's an important event in the end. Here are some trigger inciting events that have to happen, and that is go into it, right?
Yeah,
And start writing from there. So I really just use it as I just set up guideposts, put it that way.
yeah,
I set up guideposts for me to follow, which gives me a lot of flexibility to kind of write in between, to weave in amongst those guideposts. As long as I'm still hitting the mark or still, hitting what I thought were important things to have in the book, I'll just
hmm,
wander over the place. With the breakfast jury, I was much more disciplined. And part of that was because, all right, I've never written on this too plain timeline. Not only that, I need a way to interact between, the previous timeline with the jury and the current timeline with Arch. So what happens in a chapter in the jury's world needs to inflect upon what's going on with Arch. So that meant I
yeah,
needed to be very disciplined. I needed to document out how am I connecting all these things. And I actually went and sourced a completely new software to use for this that allowed me to essentially draw out a visual timeline of what was
hmm,
going on. Right, you can add chapters or scenes, and then I could sit and cut and move and see how the scenes or the chapters interacted with each other. So that was
yeah.
the most disciplined I've ever been from the
Well, and not to
plot.
mention that almost half the book was sort of nonfiction,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So you're adding so much, factual information to the story that I imagine that you had to plot a lot more for that one.
yes,
Yeah,
yep. And like I said, again, there are all these things that happened over our 4 weeks that I couldn't include in the book
yeah,
because it would just made it too long, too mundane. So being able to kind of slice and dice out and say, okay, for when we're looking at scientific evidence, right, or murder scene pictures, right, I'm going to use that in this chapter, and that's it. I'm not going to sit and dwell on those, and those kind of inform the next chapter that happens with Arch, right, and something he sees. So yeah,
right.
it was critical to be able to kind of look at what I was writing and follow that path much more clearly. Lay out a path
Yeah,
first and then follow it.
yeah. Well, what are you working on now?
So sadly, I don't have anything queued up starting January 1. So little back up a little bit. When my daughter graduated high school in 2018, I was trying to think, what do I get her, right? What do you get the girl who's got everything that nobody else has? Well, she was really big into the Walking Dead scenario at that back because that's right at the height of it. So her and her close friends, they would get together and have their Walking Dead viewing parties.
Yeah,
And it occurred to me, like 2 months into her senior year, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna write a book set in this zombie apocalypse, post-apocalyptic world that stars my daughter and her closest friends as the main characters, the heroes of this. And so it's one of these, this is not a world breaker book, right? It's a very simple timeline. They just have to go and save the world type thing. But the biggest thing was it's
awesome.
starring her and her closest friends. So I wrote that and I gave it to her and her friends for their graduation gifts. And given that I only had about 6 months to write it, I would not recommend that to anybody, right? Make that decision sooner. Well, then my son, the one who had inspired me back when he was in fourth grade, graduated high school in 2022. So it's like, well, you know what? I might as well continue this story. right? But this time it's going to feature him and his best friends. And my daughter, my daughter and her friends make an appearance in the beginning, and my daughter stays with it all the way through in the second book. So now it's my son and my daughter, kind of continuing that story in that same world. Well, in 2026, I've got a third kid that's graduating high school. So I think 2025 is pretty much preordained that I need to get that book done. And I'm not going to be an idiot this time and wait till he actually starts, his senior year and give myself 6 months. I'm actually going to start it in January, give myself enough time to kind of craft out a good ending and to this trilogy, and then give him a book that he probably not read either, but it'll be his graduation gift.
Then are you going to publish those books so that readers can find
They
them?
are. They actually all are published. They're available for
Oh,
purchase, but
okay.
they're really kind of the definition of a fiction version of a family and friends book. Right? We know
Yeah,
this. We know those people write memoirs and they just write it and they want to give it to their family and their friends because they don't really have meaning beyond that, right? For a total stranger. That was kind of the genesis of these books, but I did put them out there available for purchase because, I only gave hard copies to, the kids, right? Some of the parents, cousins, aunts, uncles, they all wanted to go out and have these books as well, just for an enjoyment factor to read. So yeah,
right.
these are published and available for purchase, and the last one will be as well.
Cool. Well, it's been a really great conversation, Ken. Where can our viewers find you and your books?
Easiest way to do that is go to kenhumphrey.com. Right from there, you'll see kind of all links to where you can purchase my books from, and that's where
Awesome.
latest news gets posted. All the other interviews that I do like this, they all get posted there. That's the easiest way. That's your landing spot for all my stuff.
Awesome. And that will be in the description of the video when I post it.
All right,
So thank
very
you
good.
so much for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me on, Tracy.
All right.